Thanks very much. I can't tell you what a pleasure it is to be here. I'm so happy to see so many people interested in this topic. I've had a really good opportunity to visit your center here, which is unbelievably wonderful. I admire the cooperation and the community that put this together and keeps it going. Not only do you tell the story of the great people who helped build the city and built the businesses that made the city thrive, but you do a very good job of telling the story of the everyday people who did the work and got up early in the morning and stayed and worked late at night to make the industry as successful as it was, and such a transformative industry throughout the world. A little bit about me. I grew up in Paterson, but I have no personal connections to the Barbours. No one in my family worked in the Paterson mills. In fact, the Paterson Barbour, the linen thread company, went out of business when I was really a young man. As you heard, I'm active in several groups in the Paterson area that are concerned about its history and its past and its future. One of them is the Hamilton Partnership, which is the Friends group of the Great Falls National Park, and in helping to develop exhibits for the Great Falls Visitor Center, Great Falls National Park Visitor Center. I was reviewing photographs and history of many of the mills that surrounded that were in the historic district around the Great Falls. Actually several of which were Barbour mills, and that got me interested. I have to say that I pulled on a linen thread and came up with a great story that unraveled before me that took me to the Barbour family. And so now on to tonight's story, which begins in Paterson. We're going to start with a Broadway reference. The Paterson story is linked to America's most Broadway-worthy founding father, Alexander Hamilton. And why is that? Hamilton looms large in Paterson's history. As an aide to General George Washington during the Revolutionary War, he traversed northern New Jersey, mostly escaping the British and avoiding fighting, but traversed the entire area. And over a period of years, he became expert in New Jersey geography, and at one point picnicked with General Washington and the Marquis de Lafayette along the banks of a giant waterfall on the Passaic River. And it was a magnificent setting. The power and the potential of the falls must have intrigued Alexander Hamilton, because he remembered it, thought about it, and it became a part of his legacy in transforming America from an independent, largely agrarian and often slave-based economy into a manufacturing economy based on free labor. Once the new union was formed, the new nation was formed, Hamilton saw the need for a manufacturing capacity. An independent America couldn't be reliant on European countries for manufactured goods, particularly goods that were necessary in a military setting. And he identified lots of those goods that were necessary, cotton in particular, cotton weaving, and one of them was flax, interestingly enough. But for the first years, he formed what was called the Society for the Establishment of Useful Manufacturers. It was a public-private partnership that built a raceway system that would power mills. It developed the infrastructure that was necessary for an industrial setting. They developed land, initially built some mills, and then made the land and with power available to entrepreneurs to come in and start industry. Sooner rather than later, things began to take root. And here's an illustration on the map on the left shows you part of the ambitious plan that developed in Paterson to lay out a series of raceways to seat mills alongside of them. The initial plan was developed by an engineer, a French engineer named Pierre L'Enfant. Early in the 19th century, the Colt family became the people who helped implement and develop the city and took the leadership of the SUM and helped transform the city of Paterson. Ultimately, the raceways were built and constructed with, as I said, with fits and starts. And it's New Jersey. We have to have a few scandals and bankruptcies, and we had all of those. But the city began to take root, and it became a successful industrial community. These are some of the early mills that were built along the river, the raceway system. Progress continued through the 1830s and 1840s, and the population began to grow. Manufacturing cotton fabric was the most successful of the new industries and was an important part of the American military because they could develop sailcloth for the Navy. It also attracted people with skills as mechanics, and not just could build the entire infrastructure that was necessary for an industrial community. A major new industry really began to thrive. Silk had a toehold in Paterson in the 1840s when John Ryle, an immigrant from a town called Macclesfield in England, outside of Manchester, which was the silk center of England, arrived in Paterson and began a silk operation in the city. Christopher Colt was the first use of silk thread, tried to manufacture silk thread, but it was unsuccessful. Ryle took it over and made it a success. And silk was the most valuable of all woven products at the time. The city really became an important silk center. But it wasn't the only industry. This is a locomotive manufacturing business that grew up in Paterson. It was called Rogers Locomotives, and it grew from a local machine shop with some, I'll call it this way, borrowed English technology. In other words, they took an English-made locomotive, figured out how it was put together, copied it, made some changes, and started manufacturing in Paterson. And over the next, until 1900, this complex manufactured over 5,000 locomotives that helped expand the American West. One of the railroads at the Transcontinental Railroad was a Paterson locomotive. These locomotives built the Panama Canal. They were indispensable and critical in the expansion of the American economy. Paterson was a pretty interesting and successful manufacturing city in its earliest stages. High tariffs on imported textiles helped American producers compete with European rivals. By 1860, Paterson had an industrial infrastructure of mills, available investors, capital was available, the labor market was improving with immigration from a variety of sources, but people with skills and opportunity who were displaced from largely European economies or communities because of changing economic factors, landed in Paterson and became the entrepreneurs that built the next wave of businesses. While silk was growing, so were these other industries. Fortunes were made, the city began to grow. So I want to just use this last slide to give you a summary of what Paterson looked like by the 1860s. And that's a critical juncture in our story here because we're going to be showing matching the place and the people. By Paterson in the 1860s, it was a growing city with a raceway system that provided water power. A canal system had been developed that was able to bring in raw products from the west into Paterson. Paterson, just so you know, is about 15 miles outside of New York City on the Passaic River, which you saw the falls. I just want to give you the context. It had access to the New York Harbor. It had access to the large markets, the fashion industry that was centered in New York, the financing industry that was centered in New York. It was strategically located, and it became its own center. And the principal industries by the 1860s, cotton mills, a rapidly growing silk industry, machine manufacturing, people who were really capable of building the machine equipment that was needed to fully furnish these mills and make them productive. Locomotives, have you seen? That was really the heaviest industry that was available growing in Paterson. And the city also built construction, structural materials for bridges and places like that. Now we come to this merger of places and people. The Barbours arrive. It's time to connect Paterson with it's our story in Paterson to your story here in Lisburn. One issue I have to point out as I begin to tell this story, the Barbours were obviously a very capable, bright people who knew their way around. However, when it came to giving names to their sons, they were exceedingly unimaginative. It's hard to tell the Barbour story without reciting 4 different names constantly over and over. John, Robert, William, Thomas. There were other names, but they just didn't seem to appeal to the Barbours. They were few and far between, so it makes recounting the story a little bit of a challenge. The Barbours started in the linen thread business in 1739 when John Barbour opened a small enterprise in Kilbarchan, Scotland. This was some 37 years before the United States declared its independence from Great Britain. The work and techniques in those early days were primitive, and my wife and I had a chance to take a look at some of the exhibits that you have here in the museum that give you a feel for what unmechanized linen production must have been like, and the amount of labor and the intensity of work that was needed. And it was obviously a very difficult and difficult hard work. In 1784, the Barbours relocated here in Ireland to a location known as Plantation, near here in Lisburn, to take advantage of the proximity to the linen source materials, as well as a steady supply of labor from the Irish countryside. The methodology was still somewhat primitive, and most of the work was done manually. The plantation remained the center of the business for 2 generations, for 2 generations, both John Barbour's, and the enterprise flourished. In 1831, a third son, John Barbour, to head the business, passed away. At his death, he had no heirs, so his younger brother, William, became the head of the family and the head of the company. William was an innovator and a big thinker. He had purchased 75 acres of land in Hilden that were powered by water power from the Langan River. Just as importantly, he had capable sons who helped to transform the business into an international empire. By the end of the 19th century, William Barbour's mill at Hilden was the largest linen thread manufacturer in the world. The Barbours were early technology adopters. In 1842, they introduced the spinning flax machine. In 1848, they installed a 16 horsepower steam engine. It was not a straight line to lots of improvements, an explosion, killed 7 people. These were innovations and untested pieces of technology that were challenging. By 1867, the Barbour works were described as 3 great structures besides many minor buildings. The image on the screen shows the enormity of the enterprise. This diagram of the Barbour family tree shows 3 generations of Barbours: John Barbour of Kilbarchan, succeeded by John Barbour of the Plantation, who died in 1823, succeeded by John Barbour Jr., who died in 1831 of the Plantation. When he died in 1831, he was succeeded by his brother William, which we've just discussed, whose 5 sons transformed the business into a modern and thriving enterprise. In the mid to late 19th century, the business was strengthened by the contributions of these talented sons, each of which had their own areas of expertise. John Dougherty Barbour was the executive leader. He's what we would call the CEO. James, the youngest, and you can see this is the 5 sons of John Barbour of Wilden. Of William Barbour, who succeeded John Barbour, who passed away. John Dougherty of Hilden was the CEO. James was the youngest, and he was the technology leader, and stayed here in Hilden, supervising manufacture. He was what we would call the chief technology officer. The Paterson connection lies in the contribution and capabilities of the 3 middle sons, Robert, Samuel, and Thomas. The 2 with the greatest impact were Thomas and Robert Barbour. And fortunately, when you go downstairs later, you'll be able to see portraits of these gentlemen. On the left is Thomas, and the right is Robert, both of whom spent several years in Paterson, establishing the business in the United States and New Jersey. Thomas was born in 1832. He had arrived in New York City at the age of 17. He first worked for A.T. Stewart Company, another enterprise that had roots here in Lisburn. By 1852, he learned all he needed to know about the Stewart business as working as a representative in New York. And then he associated with the family business in New York City. In 1862, he became a field partner in the family business. He and his brother Samuel spent some time in New York, his brother Samuel spent some time in New York, but returned when his wife died. Thomas was a tall, imposing, smart, charismatic man who made an impression on New York. The timing for an American branch of the company was nothing short of opportune. During the era of the American Civil War, tariffs on imports of foreign manufacturers were increased, while the taxes on equipment were eliminated. As a result, the American affiliate of the Barbour Company made a lot of sense. They could manufacture here, they could start a new operation in America that would be competitive from a tariff point of view on all fronts, and help develop and expand the market for Barbour thread. As I said, the Barbours were colorful and well known in New York. A local writer observed that the Barbours were big physically, big intellectually, and big gastronomically. And the brothers' plans were as large as their proportions. That was kind of the local write-up on the Barbours during that time. Now, the 2 branches of our story, the Paterson story and the Barbour story, come together. In 1864, the house of William Barbour and Sons, the parent company here in Lisburn, established a Brant Works in where else? Paterson. in the building that preceded this one on the site. The factory was operated as the Barbour Flax Spinning Company with Thomas as president. The firm leased and then purchased factories, acquired some tenement houses for their workers, and obtained the necessary water that they needed to run a flax operation, because flax has an intense need for water. They created a dedicated reservoir or pond that is known to this day as Barbour Pond, and still is now part of our county park system. It's still one of the major it's now become one of the major recreational features of our county. And it provided all the water that was needed for the manufacturing of flax. In 1867, only 3 years after the Barbours took control of the Paterson plant, the factory employed 450 workers and was active in the manufacture of linen thread. The Barbours were recruiting labor from Ireland here and from other parts of the world, and attracting them to Paterson. Almost immediately, the company needed to expand again, and as soon as 1872 began the foundations for a second complex, which would become the largest of 3 plants that they owned. Now you see the 3 plants. Unlike in Hilden, the plants are separated throughout the city. They're smaller, they have a smaller footprint, but they are very big buildings. The images show the 3 major Barbour plants in Paterson. 2 in the Great Falls area, and 1 near further out. By that time, steam power eliminated the necessity to be on the raceway system. By 1881, the production of the firm was $2.5 million in value, and they employed 1,500 workers in Paterson alone. Their continued affiliation with the William Barbour and Sons enterprise here in Northern Ireland was a major benefit, and it provided an interplay of technology and finance, marketing capabilities, being able to orchestrate the most efficient production in the most efficient location. The production in Paterson was, again, based on shoe threads and linen threads that were used in a variety of industries, and that were necessary for all kinds of manufacturing during those days. This shows where the Barbours located. This is the raceway system. Here's the Great Falls that you saw the picture of. Here's the raceway system. The first plants ended up here. And the second plant, this is a map in 1872, was located here. You can see the city was starting to be developed, and the Barbours were major enterprises and some of the largest landowners in the city, but they weren't the dominant industry in Paterson. At this point in the 1870s, silk employed more people and had a higher value. It was a higher value product because silk was in such demand. One of the interesting footnotes is there's a neighborhood still in Paterson called the Dublin neighborhood, and the Dublin neighborhood was the first residential area in the city. Irish were imported or found work building the raceway system initially, helping to build the canal, and then were employed as mill workers and workers in general in the community. There's still people in Paterson who I identify as coming from the Dublin neighborhood. There was a spring that gave it its name. It was the center of the Irish community and other ethnicities as well. It was a neighborhood that adjoined the Barbour plants, and lots of Barbour workers were living in the Dublin neighborhood. The Barbours didn't provide the level of housing that they did I understand they would provide housing for workers. In Paterson, it was more of a free market system. People were responsible for workers were able to find their own housing. The Barbours owned some tenements, but mostly they left that to the workers to find their way. Working for the Barbours was more than just a a job in a mill. It was part of your social life. Here's the Barbour Grand Street baseball team in the 1880s. And it was working at the Barbour Mill was considered a good place to work in Paterson. They paid a little bit better than most of the other mills. It was still very hard work. Working in a linen thread operation, I'm sure, was noisy and hot and dangerous. But the Barbour Mills had a very good reputation as a place to work, and I haven't seen any evidence of really serious labor troubles that hounded other industries in Paterson, and particularly the silk industry, which was a very competitive industry, had significant labor troubles. The Barbours seemed to avoid all of that, and when other mills would go out on strike, sometimes the Barbours would pick up the unemployed strikers, offer them a little bit more money than they were earning in their other job, and found them, and they ended up with new jobs. This is from your collection, and I just want to point out that two of these mills are actually Paterson mills, this one and the one on top. The Paterson operation was very much a part of the importance. Let me just add a few final words about Thomas. As I mentioned, Thomas served as the CEO of Paterson Operations and remained close to his Irish family. Thomas was close to his father back in Lisburn, and made frequent trips back and forth. Story has it that when he was here in 1884, he learned of the birth of one of his grandchildren. He celebrated a bit too much, and he was cajoled into signing an extension to his will with an X that deeded a significant portion of his property to his Irish relatives. It became a legendary case here of a contested will. We're now going to introduce Thomas's son, also William Barbour, and his wife Adelaide. This is the couple who really led the company to international prominence with the relatives here in Northern Ireland. William Barbour was born in 1857, before his father had expanded the business to Paterson. Though born in New York City, William grew up in New Jersey, initially in Paterson. Thomas, by the way, had a rather lovely home in the Paterson area, where he entertained former President Ulysses S. Grant and others, and he traveled in high circles. William was finishing up high school in New Jersey, and at that point was among the Barbours were among the wealthiest and most successful families in northern New Jersey. William decided not to go to college, but instead was given the opportunity to tour Europe and study in France and Germany, to learn the ways of a very progressive industry that was growing up in both of those countries. He married a woman named Julia Adelaide Sprague in 1883. And according to the family recollections of their descendants in New Jersey, the relationship of Willie and Addie was a loving and happy one. They had disparate tastes and disparate preferences. He loved the city, but was much happier in an outdoor setting. She really loved the city. She was a teetotaler who really kept alcohol consumption at home to an absolute minimum. She was a tall, elegant woman with strong principles and a proper background. Adelaide was a direct descendant of Richard Warren, who arrived in Massachusetts on the Mayflower. So her roots in the colonies was longstanding, and she came from a prominent family. One of the family members, in their recollections, figured that they were eighth cousins. They were probably related somehow. William Barbour joined the company after his big grand tour. He expanded beyond the linen thread company with his activities. He was on a range of boards, bank boards. He was the consummate, well-connected, innovative industrialist who was building the American economy during this period. He was close to another Patersonian named Garrett Hobart, who was a vice president of the United States during this period when William McKinley was president, and he was close to other leading families in the United States. He served as a military adjutant to a governor in New Jersey named John Griggs, and consequently picked up the title colonel, and for his entire career he was known as Colonel Barbour, and he used that title for the rest of his life. His business acumen was extraordinary. When you think about what this collection of family members was able to accomplish during this period without telephones, without faxes, without cell phones, they built this powerhouse enterprise that spanned 2 continents and had branches throughout Europe as well. In 1898, the American branch of the business and the Northern Ireland branch of the Ireland branch of the business and other affiliated businesses combined into one, and this was a real key to continuing success. They were able to share technology, share marketing information, expand their international presence, and avoid antitrust regulations that were emerging in the United States because they were a Irish-based company headquartered in Glasgow. So it was a very successful benefit. Colonel Barbour and his family lived quite well. They had a home in New York and a home on the Jersey Shore. This was their home at the Jersey Shore, one of their homes. This is a townhouse that William Barbour built and his wife built. Was located at 1315 West 53rd Street, one of the best neighborhoods at the time in New York City. It was opened in 1903 and designed by a prominent architect. The limestone townhouse was state-of-the-art. It had its own power plant and an early electric elevator. It was filled with French furniture and antiques. It had a pipe organ and 2 pianos. Sadly, and this is a part of the sad story of American progress, the building had a lifespan of about 20 years. It was built in 1905. In 1925, John D. Rockefeller wanted to assemble a site for the Museum of Modern Art in New York, and went to all of the landowners and made them an offer that was so attractive that they turned over the property, they sold the property. And that was the case with this Barbour mansion. So when you go to New York, make sure you visit the Museum of Modern Art and look at the site where it's on, and you'll say this was part of the site is connected to my hometown in Lisburn. Let me talk a little bit about William and Adelaide Barbour's family. This photo shows Colonel and Mrs. Barbour, probably taken at their Adirondack, New York mountain estate, where they owned several thousand acres and had a camp that was a wonderful retreat from their life in New York and the Jersey Shore. It was on Tepper Lake, and it was apparently the Colonel's absolute favorite place in the world. And you can see that he had 4 sons, Frederick, William Warren, Robert, and Thomas. Let me talk a little bit about those 4 sons. They all had interesting lives. Here's a brief introduction. Thomas Barbour, the oldest of the sons, you can see up on the left. As a young man, he was taken to Harvard University to take a look around. And he was entranced by the Museum of Comparative Zoology at Harvard. And at a very young age, he said, "This is where I want to go. This is my future." And sure enough, he went to Harvard and got his bachelor's, master's, and PhD, and studied with some of the leading biologists of the era. He actually never left Harvard. He had the ability, because of his family, to travel around the world and have camps and encampments in places where he could conduct his collections and maintain and write about his passion for the natural environment. His works are still considered masterful. Robert Barbour was the technical expert who stayed in the New York, New Jersey area. He actually lived most of his life in New Jersey. He graduated from the Columbia University School of Engineering and was focused on the technical aspects of the business. As a teenager, he reportedly assembled an automobile in his room in that townhouse that you saw, and then they had to figure out a way to get it out of the house and onto the street, which they ultimately did. The youngest of the boys was Frederick Barbour. He was a Princeton graduate, stayed with the family business as an executive, and was well known as an outdoorsman, collector of fine furniture, which has been gifted to the state of Connecticut back in the States, but was a successful business person as part of the business enterprise. Now let me talk about William Warren Barbour, or Warren Barbour, as he's known. This is probably the most unusual Barbour story that one can imagine. A highly unlikely set of personal history. William and Adelaide Barbour's third son was born on July 31st, 1888, in Monmouth County, New Jersey. That's the area near the shore. He was named William Warren, although he was always called Warren to distinguish himself from his father. He spent his elementary school years at a private school in Manhattan, and when he graduated, his parents gave him the opportunity of attending college, and he was accepted at Princeton University, one of the most prestigious schools in the United States, or engaging in a more practical education, as it was called. Warren was a big strapping young man, and if he went to Princeton, he would likely play football and be part of the football team that was a celebrated collection of athletes. He chose not to do that and went to work for his family business. He thought the line was that he could learn firsthand and at a young age the duties which would someday be his obligations. Well, that's the way it started out. He worked for the business for a few years and unfortunately developed tuberculosis. And tuberculosis was obviously a very serious disease, particularly around this time period. And to treat it, one of the best ways to treat it was to get out into fresh air, away from the big city. That was the thinking in those days. So he spent several years up in that Adirondack camp that his family owned. When he came back from that Adirondack camp, he was pudgy and out of shape, and his parents were not happy about it. So they said to him, "Get into shape, and we know how to do it." After speaking to family friend Teddy Roosevelt, who was a vigorous athletic advocate, Warren Barbour ended up at a boxing camp. After a period of years, Warren Barbour became very good at boxing. Soon he was sparring with with very accomplished professionals or advanced amateurs. He was boxing people who were far older and larger than him. I think you can see this. The headline is, "Rich Man's Son is Champion Amateur Boxer." This is a headline from the New York Times. The team behind Warren Barbour advised that he was ready to take on really serious competition and test his skills with more accomplished opponents. With his coaching team's advice, he entered the World Heavyweight Amateur Boxing Championship in Boston. And in 1910, Barbour took on two well-regarded amateur boxers in a single night. The ringside crowd was skeptical, and this was a quote from the New York Times, that a young fellow with a wad of money big enough to choke a horse would amount to anything much in the ring. Well, they were proven wrong. Barbour, his first fight was against the New England champion, a man named Kendall Salisbury, which Barbour fairly easily won. After a challenging second bout with a hard-charging brawler named Joe Burke, Barbour emerged as the national champion, the world's amateur heavyweight champion. He was only 22 and was now the object of national attention in the United States. I want to talk for a minute about what boxing was all about in the United States during this era. This is a story. The boxing champion was a man named Jack Johnson, who was the first African American to take the championship, and it caused tremendous consternation throughout parts of the United States. Tremendous joy in other parts. In the black community, he was a national hero, but there were lots of people in the American community who were not happy that a black man had beaten a white man in the ring. And boxing was America's most popular sport. It had the biggest following. Matches would draw tens of thousands of people. And there was lots of money to be made in boxing. And at this moment, with Johnson as the champion, the search was on to find someone who could take him on and beat him. This gets me to the second Broadway reference for tonight, the play that you may have seen or heard about, The Great White Hope. And The Great White Hope was that person who could take on Jack Johnson and challenge him and beat him. Our own Warren Barbour was heavily touted and promoted by lots of people to be that man who would take on Jack Johnson and be the Great White Hope. Gentleman Jim Corbett, who was a champion boxer, he was promoting Warren Barbour heavily. Teddy Roosevelt thought he was the guy that could beat Jack Johnson. It was a troubling time in America for lots of racial issues. This was just a manifestation of some of the racial tensions that existed in the United States. And every time that Johnson would win a fight, there might be a lynching or a murder of black people, just as a way of expressing that dissatisfaction with the situation. Why didn't Warren Barbour take this on? Well, his parents objected. His father thought it was undignified to take money and win prizes for boxing. That wasn't what gentlemen would do. His mother reportedly, and this is through family recollections and family stories, had a different attitude. She felt, first of all, she had every confidence that if Warren entered the ring with Jack Johnson, Warren would win. However, she expressed to him a concern that it would create such bad feeling in the black community that she didn't want him to be the one to break the hearts of all those African Americans who were fans of Jack Johnson. It's a great story. I'm not sure that His mother was completely objective in this analysis. Johnson was a great champion, but the long and the short of it is Warren Barbour was touted as the great white hope, as one of many great white hopes, but didn't pursue the fight. And I think that's probably a good thing. But there's a theory that the entire episode sensitized Warren Barbour to issues of racial prejudice and the difficulties, the distress that was facing the black community in the United States as a result of discrimination, lynchings, and the violence that was perpetrated against members of the black community. And this Jack Johnson episode was just an example of it. But it was something he developed a real concern for and a real passion. So post-boxing, Barbour worked for the family business. He worked in the office in New York of the Linen Thread Company. He began to, he served in the National Guard in the military. He looked back on this era of his life in the National Guard as with a lot of joy and satisfaction. He served in what was known as the Squadron A, which was a group of socially prominent New Yorkers who rode horseback and were trained as cavalry. He served on the Mexican border, and I think he had a very, may have been his substitute for college, where he never developed that camaraderie. This is where he had developed friends that he kept for his life. But his life would change. Things took a dramatic turn for the whole Barbour family in March of 1917, when the colonel passed away of a heart attack on his way to his office. By that time, the Linen Thread Company was a complicated and complex organization, but it was an effective one that knew how to do what it was going to do. Warren took over as the president of the American operations. And he did that for several years very successfully. He was also active in politics, supporting Republican candidates. He and his wife moved to a beautiful home in Rumson, New Jersey, now probably best known as the home, that area, the home of Bruce Springsteen, who I understand is visiting here in Ireland. But it's the elegant part of the Jersey Shore, and they lived a very comfortable life there. Warren ran for mayor of his town of Rumson, and here's this is really when he began taking on adult responsibilities, for lack of a better word. He married Elizabeth Cochran Carrere, who was the sister of his younger brother, and Carrere was the niece of a very famous architect who was very prominent in society. And again, when you come to New York and you look at the New York Public Library, that's a building that was designed by Warren Barbour's uncle-in-law. By the late 1920s, after doing this for several years and having his life in good order, Warren decided to run for mayor of Rumson, and he did, and won. He ran unopposed, actually, and as an indication of his generosity and his commitment to the town, he donated the town hall to Rumson, and you can see an image of that building. Beginning in 1930, he was the president of the Tariff Association that was critical to the family business's success in maintaining a taxing environment that was in line with their needs. He was active in fundraising and became a part of the Republican Party. He tried an attempt at Congress that didn't work, and that worked out fine. And what happened was that in 1931, one of the sitting U.S. senators, one of the sitting U.S. senators for New Jersey, a man named Dwight Morrow, passed away in office, and the Republican Party had the opportunity to name a replacement for him, and Warren Barbour was selected as the U.S. Senator for New Jersey. And this is a job that Warren Barbour pursued for the remainder of his life. He had to run for office several times. In 1931, he was appointed for 4 years of the remaining term. And in 1936, he lost his seat when Franklin Roosevelt was at the peak of his popularity. He was a Democrat. Barbour was a Republican. The Republicans were swept out of office because of the Roosevelt team was doing a job that was deemed to be very effective, and so the Republicans were out. But then he ran again in 1940 and won a full term, won a full seat. And you can see that in this article, his boxing past became part of his identity and his hallmark. He was the ex-heavyweight champion who ran for Senate. Barbour's Senate career, which spanned those years that I just described, was really an interesting one. He was a combination of influences and forces, and he had his own personality and his own style. He followed, for the most part, the Republican agenda. He was a fiscal conservative. Initially in the 30s, he was something of an isolationist, in spite of the threat of the German rise in Europe. In this time of the of the Depression, there was pressure to lower wages. He fought that. He didn't want wages to be full. And this is one that struck me as highly unusual. There was an issue of middle-aged discrimination because so many people had lost their jobs. There was a practice in American business to discriminate against middle-aged workers, to take younger workers who were readily available, who would work at lower wages. And in reading about it, middle-aged people were 40, which to me sounds a little skewed, but that just means, imagine being considered functionally obsolete at age 40. Well, Barbour didn't like that and fought against it. And he was noteworthy on several progressive issues. He was one of the first senators back in the 30s to promote legislation that would ban and prosecute lynching as a federal crime. He must have been touched by the experience in boxing. He was for what they call open public accommodations. And in this era, Washington, D.C., our nation's capital, was completely segregated and discriminatory. A black person couldn't get a hotel room in the conventional hotels. Restaurants could ban people of color or whatever. He introduced legislation to prohibit trade with a nation engaged in religious or racial persecution. Again, a very progressive and directed way to limit the United States and their connections with some of the rising powers that had extreme racial prejudice built into their system. He was a true social liberal. This campaign literature from his 1938 campaign shows that he fought for Social Security. This was, again, not very popular and not very common with other Republicans. The party of big business was not so crazy about Social Security. As I said, he fought against discrimination against older workers. He was, during one of the periods in which he was out of office, he worked for the New Jersey Unemployment Compensation Commission, which helped facilitate benefits for people who were unemployed. And as I mentioned earlier, again, promoted anti-lynching legislation and this reciprocal trade agreement. What's also interesting, and these are some news articles that I found, he was close to the black community in New Jersey and in the States. This shows him speaking. Senate candidate will speak at a rally of, it was a collection of black political leaders gathered in New Jersey. Barbour was reaching out to that community. And our political divide in the United States now is so severe, unfortunately, that this seems unusual, that someone from one party would reach out to what would be perceived as constituents of the other party and make an effort to cross lines. This is another interesting point. The ban on films of boxing was still in effect in the 1930s. And Barbour introduced legislation to allow those films to be widely distributed. If a black man won the fight, show the picture of the black man winning the fight. If a white guy won the fight, show that picture, but don't ban it, don't discriminate against it. During the early years of World War II, he recognized the injustice that was facing refugees in Europe. And the United States had a very restrictive policy about letting people emigrate into the United States during that period. We were not a welcoming country. Barbour was one of the people who fought that. This is another article in a black newspaper in New Jersey, an African American newspaper, describing that he was promoting anti-lynching legislation, and to make that known to the black community that he was an advocate who was on their side. And in elections, Barbour would outperform other Republicans with black voters because they recognized that he had their concerns. And one other group that he was active in was a group called the Council Against Intolerance in America. This was a national group made up of people with multiple backgrounds: Protestants, Catholics, Jews, blacks, whites, and it promoted programs that explained the commonality of people rather than exploited the differences. And it was an attempt to build a national cohesion, especially as we faced a wartime threat. The thought of having these pockets of insulation was not an effective policy, and it was not helpful to the national effort. And I think from Barbour's point of view, just not the right thing to do. It was unfair. It was unseemly. It was just not right. And he fought against that on a national level. And this article that you see on the right was a column that was published in a Jewish newspaper in Paterson in the year 1941, and it was a call for tolerance. And he was reaching out not only to the black community but to the Jewish community. And I happen to be the president of a historical society and we have an active group back in New Jersey that focuses on the history of the Jewish community in the Paterson, North Jersey area. And we saw this, and we had a discussion amongst ourselves saying, wow, who is this Warren Barbour? Why did he do this? And we've got to learn more about it, and I'm going to explain that in a little more detail. And Barbour's commitment to the plight of European Jews is best evidenced by one of the final things that he did in his life. By the mid-1940s, the situation in Europe was so desperate that a group of rabbis throughout the United States gathered and went to Washington to try to petition some attention from President Roosevelt, and had a rabbis' march on Washington. These were not rabbis from the largest and the largest cities. These were smaller rabbis, many of whom were European refugees themselves, and were fully aware of what was going on in Europe and were very concerned about it. They came to Washington to plea for more openness in the immigration policy, and went to the White House. And when they got to the White House, they were told Franklin Roosevelt, even though he had nothing on his calendar, was not available. And in the meantime, he was escorted out the back door and refused to see them. Where did they go? They ended up in the office of Warren Barbour, who greeted them warmly and heard their story. The date is October 15th, 1943. It's a New York Times article that says a resolution under which up to 100,000 victims of Axis persecution because of religious belief or race would be allowed to come into the United States. Who was the sponsor of this legislation? Warren Barbour. Unfortunately, just a few days later, Warren Barbour passed away at home in November of 1943. He died of a heart attack. He died in his Washington, in his home, and he was only 55 years old. The process of advancing the legislation that he proposed required somebody in the Senate to be the point person, the leader in an effort to make that happen. When Barbour died, no one stepped in to take that role. Soon after Barbour's death, the entire issue of rescue took on a new life at a much smaller scale, and ultimately a modest piece of legislation did pass, even though it was the concept had large support throughout the country. It was still controversial, and no one with Warren Barbour's moral clarity took it on. As a result, about 90,000, several thousand ended up emigrating into the United States and being able to rebuild their lives. So this is Warren Barbour's final resting place in Paterson. There is a cemetery that has a Barbour plot that Colonel Barbour brought down from their estate in the Adirondacks, a large boulder, had it carved with the name Barbour. You can see that, and then surrounding that spot is a series of family plots. Family descendants and others have speculated that Barbour's health issues were related to problems with alcohol. And that led to a deterioration of his marriage, and then ultimately deterioration of his health. His 1941 divorce and the awarding of full custody of his children to his wife reportedly undermined his happiness and ultimately his physical health. It was a tragedy on multiple levels, and this condition probably contributed to his untimely demise. I like this picture that shows the warmth of Warren Barbour. He's standing in front of a hotel greeting constituents and business people, and I think there's lots of family pictures that show him in a happy state. This is something that I know that's come up. What are the remnants of this Barbour legacy in Paterson? Is there anything, when you come to Paterson, and I hope you all do, what can you look for? Well, this is one of the mills. This is one of the linen thread mills that has been repurposed for a school. I think this was actually called the Hilden Mill at one point back in the day. And it's been beautifully restored. The others are all standing, but they're used for storage or whatever, or secondary uses. There is a Barbour Street right adjacent to this site, and that's there. There's one house remaining of a Barbour mansion called Kilbarkin. It wasn't owned by the Colonel Barbour's family. It was owned by cousins. Unfortunately, it's in a bad state of repair, but it's a rather elegant house that shows how the Barbours were able to, could live if they wanted to. This was the home of Robert Edwards Barbour, the grandson of one of the other Barbour who came to Paterson. It has 42 rooms, and as I said, it was named Kilbarkin. It was rather elegant in every respect. Unfortunately, it's fallen into disrepair. And there's Barbour's Pond, which is now part of the park system of Passaic County. It's really quite lovely, and it's not used for manufacture anymore. It just is a great place to take kids fishing and recreation. Well, I just want to talk about what our organization, the Jewish Historical Society, did. Reading the story and learning about it, we decided that we had to do something to honor the memory of Warren Barbour, who frankly is not very well known in New Jersey. His story, you know now more about it than 99% of the people in the New Jersey or New York area. Because he died at such a young age, his story isn't well known, and we felt that was really unfortunate. So we had a seminar where we had the scholar that we've engaged, and we invited, we told a lot of the story that you heard today, a lot more emphasis on his political career, but it was a wonderful gathering. We had it in a Barbour Mill, and which was only fitting, and we had 8 of his grandchildren. We invited 8 of the Barbour grandchildren we were able to identify to come learn about their grandfather. None of them had ever had the chance to meet him. He died long before they were born, but all were curious and interested, and I'm sure when the word gets back, and I intend to deliver it, to come to Lisburn, to see the Barbour legacy here, to come to the Linen Center, the Linen Museum, and get a feel for the significance of the Barbour family here in Ireland. I have a feeling you'll be seeing more Barbours in the future. But that's that repurposed mill that you saw. And I'd like to close with the Barbour subject, something from the Barbour column that I quoted earlier. It seems to me to capture the spirit of Barbour and to raise some questions about why was he, what happened in his life that or didn't, what's in the Barbour gene pool, whatever, that made him a really decent guy who really cared about other people whose interests were not necessarily aligned with his, but were the right thing to do. And I think this quote begins to get to the point. There can be no peace until human beings everywhere recognize the rights of others less fortunate than they, or possess different religious or philosophies, to live and work under comparable conditions of comfort and freedom. Tolerance lies at the bottom of the whole problem. Enduring peace will only be found only in the doctrine of live and let live. What a message. So as we celebrate the memory and the legacy of Warren Barbour, the stretch that he made from the comfort of his life to taking on causes that were worthwhile and necessary to for an appropriate lifestyle. I have a feeling the same message that of tolerance and living and let live resonates here in Ireland with all of your history as it does with me in America and all of ours. So thank you.
We've been working on an engagement project with people associated with Hilden School and the Mill And time again, when we talk to people who either went to school or worked in the mill, there is a huge reverence to the Barbour family about what they did and how they went about. And perhaps it resonates with your last quote. In terms of the mills in Paterson, have you any sense of what the mill workers would have thought about the family?
We're not as good, we don't have as long a memory in America as you do here in Ireland, for better and worse, I guess. But mostly, the mill shut down in the early 1950s, I believe. It's hard to find anyone who worked in the. I haven't met anyone who worked in the Barbour mills. They stopped working in the 1950s. That's quite a while ago already. As I said, the people in Paterson don't really know this story, and that's part of the reasons that we're taking it on, and that we'll take it on in the national park setting, in the visitor center, the historical society, the Jewish Historical Society, is efforting to keep the story alive, but our memory isn't that good, and because he died at such an early age so long ago, and was out of Paterson at that point for a good part of his life, he really lived outside of the city. The Barbour name and particularly the Warren Barbour story just isn't that well known.
I know that John Barbour came from Scotland to Ireland, and I'm not quite sure which Barbour actually went to Paterson. Were there Barbours already there?
I can go back. There's a chart. There's a chart that shows. Let me do that if I can. Here we go. This shows the entire family tree from Scotland. John Barbour of Kilbarchan, near Paisley, way up on top, and who they begat and where they lived. The Paterson connection doesn't begin until the sons of William Barbour, who lived between it says 1797 and 1875. So three of his sons, Robert Kennedy Barbour, Samuel Barbour, and Thomas Barbour, were the first Barbours to be in the state.
And why did they choose Paterson?
Why? Because it was a conducive city that would allow them to have a successful industrial operation. It had water power, it had labor, it had land, it was near New York, and it was available.
I've been doing some research on the family tree. I'm a Barbour.
Oh.
And you've got John Barbour of Kilbarchan marrying Jean Connell and stating that his son is John Barbour, who married Bridget Connell. You see the first line. Now, the research that I've done states that, or seems to show that John Barbour of Plantation, his father was a man called Bailey John Barbour, and that John Barbour, who married Jean Connell, was a cousin, not the ancestor. There's a lady called Helen Calcuth of the Renfrewshire Historical Society who's done a booklet on it, and she came to the same conclusion. Then I gave her some more information, and she's now gone away to research because she says that that's wrong, I'm wrong, and there's another John Barbour.
That's the problem of having the same name for every.
Yeah, I know. I'd be interested to know where you get that connection from.
I got this from the Passaic County Historical Society, who sponsored a program on the Barbours back in the 1970s, and the research that was done by the local historian and staff, which was cutting edge research at the time, came up with this table. Well, I have this, whatever. I'll be glad to share whatever they have. They do have I think I sent it to James. James has the write-up that they did. And in fact, I spoke to that gentleman, John Herbst, who was working in a local school and as a school project said, let's learn about the Barbours. But I'm going to be perfectly honest with you. My interest is when the Barbours meet Paterson, right? The way the Barbours from 200 years ago is less interest to me, but I want to get the story right.
Barbour, who had the title Colonel,
Yes.
did he actually have military experience?
It was an honorary. He was appointed as the head of the honorary head of the New Jersey National Guard or something like that. But he didn't serve in the military. He was too busy running his business. And he's the Barbour, the colonel who had a very close relationship with the Irish branch of the family, and it was instrumental in combining the two firms into one that was a key part of the financial success of the combined enterprise. And I know that William Barbour, there's so many portraits downstairs of the Barbours who were part of this era. Three of those, at least three, were spent time in Paterson. So I was glad to be in the room with them. And I know that William Barbour is a name that I've heard a lot about in the business aspects of the Barbour Linen Thread Company and the combined enterprise.
Is your Jewish Historical Society, is that just in Paterson or is it US-wide?
Well, we're just the Paterson, Passaic, the Passaic, our county area, essentially. There are other organizations that have broader areas, but we think the Barbour story deserves much wider distribution, and we're going to try to do something about that. Can I just make one quick request? Stay seated. I want to have a picture taken with you in the audience. No one will believe me back in New Jersey that this many people were interested in what I've been talking about and rambling about to friends and family for a period of years. So just stay in your seats for a second, and if you'll be a backdrop, is that okay? Do you mind? Thank you all for coming.